computers get hot. I mean, really hot. They're basically electricity to heat converters that occasionally do something useful just to justify the power bill. Back in the day, things were simple. CPU were weak, didn't melt themselves, and cooling was basically a plastic cap pretending to be a heatsink. So today, I'm testing a truly cursed idea. Gaming with no cooler at all. How long can a modern CPU survive before turning itself into digital lava? Stay tuned. As CPU kept getting more powerful, the amount of heat they produced grew right along with them, to the point where we literally had to stick a chunk of metal on top just to keep them from melting. But of course, that wasn't the end of it. CPU kept evolving, and temperatures kept rising, and the next solution was to slap a fan on that block of metal to blow all the heat out into the room, the same place we throw everything else we don't know how to deal with. Eventually, to make coolers safer and easier to install, manufacturers introduced the IHS, the Integrated Heat Spreader. It's basically a metal helmet for the CPU die, helping transfer heat more efficiently and preventing people from accidentally crushing the bare silicon while mounting their cooler. The IHS is actually strong enough to let a CPU run for a few seconds, sometimes even tens of seconds, with no cooler attached at all. And that got me thinking, what happens if we run a CPU with absolutely no cooler? Can it still play games? Will it thermal throttle instantly, or will it straight up shut down? More importantly, I wanted to try a few non-traditional cooling methods. No heat sinks, no fans, just to see if there's any weird or unofficial way to keep a CPU cool enough to stay alive. For this experiment, I'm using an Intel Core i3 7100, and the choice is pretty simple, but also very strategic. First, it's a low-power chip with modest heat output, which makes it much safer for testing weird, non-traditional cooling methods. Second, it's an older, inexpensive CPU, so if something goes horribly wrong, it won't break my heart or my wallet the way destroying a high-end chip would. Maybe you don't know, running a CPU at high temperatures can cause all kinds of problems. Throttling, freezing, sudden shutdowns, and long-term damage to the chip. In extreme cases, if the heat keeps climbing with no proper cooling, it can even burn itself out. So yeah, a CPU without a cooler is basically a disaster waiting to happen. And that's exactly why this experiment is both a terrible idea and a really fun one. Now it's time to test how much we can actually cool this CPU without using a real cooler. And just to be clear, this is purely for fun. Please do not try this at home under any circumstances. First, we need a baseline. I'll boot up the system with the basic stock cooler and check the temperatures. At idle on Windows, the CPU sits around 45 degrees Celsius. Once I jump into a game, it climbs by about 10 degrees, hovering around 55 degrees Celsius. At that point, the CPU is running at 100% load, hitting its full 3.9 GHz boost clock. Honestly, perfect temperatures for gaming. So that's the goal. Try to keep the CPU somewhere near that range, using completely unconventional cooling methods. So what happens if we keep the heatsink but remove the fan completely? I unplugged the fan cable and let the system run to see how bad things would get. And yeah, it got bad fast. Just sitting on the Windows desktop, the temperature shot up to 96 degrees Celsius. Once I launched a game, it immediately hit 100 degrees Celsius, and the CPU was forced to throttle down to 3.3 GHz instead of the normal 3.9 GHz. The CPU basically slows itself down on purpose to avoid overheating, but that also means the whole system becomes sluggish, stuttery, and pretty uncomfortable to use. So yeah, passive cooling alone is not enough for this chip. Next, I tried using the poor little stock fan by itself. No full cooler, just the fan blowing directly onto the CPU's metal surface, to see if it would make any meaningful difference. And honestly, it worked way better than I expected. At idle, the temperature dropped to around 65 degrees Celsius, which is a massive improvement compared to using just a bare heatsink. But the problem is, it doesn't stay cool for long. After a bit of runtime, the temps slowly climb back up and eventually pass 90 degrees Celsius, landing right back in the danger zone. Pretty unfortunate. And in games, it's only slightly better. The CPU manages to hold about 100 MHz more clock speed compared to pure passive cooling. But the temperature still climbs too high and performance stays unstable. So yeah, better than nothing, but still nowhere near usable. I figured maybe the airflow just wasn't strong enough. So I brought out the big guns, a full-size dust blower powerful enough to launch anything under 500 grams straight off the table. If anything could save this CPU, it's this monster. I pointed it directly at the chip and fired it up, and honestly I was shocked. The temperature actually started dropping, slowly but clearly, In about a minute, it fell by roughly 16 degrees Celsius, which gave me hope that it could go even lower if I kept blasting it. And in-game, there was improvement. Nothing crazy, but enough to keep temps around 85 to 90 degrees Celsius. Most importantly, the CPU was finally able to hold 3.9 GHz again without throttling, so the gameplay felt smoother overall. But here's the problem. This cooling method is absolutely ridiculous. The dust blower uses hundreds of times more power than a normal CPU fan, and the noise level is insane, like sitting behind a jet engine. There's no way anyone could actually game next to this thing. So while it technically works, the side effects are catastrophic. So I decided to take things even further. I grabbed a stainless steel cup, flipped it upside down so the flat bottom sat directly on the CPU, and filled it with ice cubes. And unbelievably, it actually worked. In-game, the temperature dropped to around 35 degrees Celsius in just 3 minutes, with a low point of 61 degrees Celsius under full load. When idle, it stayed between 30 and 35 degrees Celsius, even continuing to fall, to the point where I started worrying the CPU might be getting too cold. But of course, this method comes with problems. First is condensation. Water forming on the outside of the cup can drip onto the motherboard and instantly short it out. You can try wrapping the cup in paper towels or using dry ice, but the risk is still there. Second, the cup isn't secure at all. One tiny bump and it could tip over straight onto your components. And third, the cooling only lasts until the ice melts. So to extend the cooling session, I built a little DIY solution. A plastic tube sealed with heat-resistant silicone, packed full of ice to keep the temperature stable for longer. Honestly, the results completely blew me away. The temperatures dropped even more than I expected, settling at around 55 degrees Celsius, basically identical to what the CPU would run at with a normal stock cooler. I let the system run for quite a while, and to my surprise, the temp stayed rock solid with zero signs of thermal throttling. Performance-wise, it genuinely wasn't any worse than using a real cooler. But of course, this still isn't a long-term solution. I mean, I'm not trying to play a few rounds of a game only to sprint back and refill the ice every 10 minutes. So that got me thinking, maybe there's a more permanent approach. What if I could improve passive cooling by carving small grooves into the CPU's surface to increase airflow and surface area? Kind of like giving it tiny heatsink fins? Before risking any expensive hardware, I decided to test this crazy idea on a cheap Pentium G 2020 first. Without any cooler, the CPU normally shoots straight up to around 100 degrees Celsius, basically instant overheating. But after carving those grooves into the test CPU, I was shocked once again. The temperature dropped all the way down to around 60 degrees Celsius, a massive 40-degree reduction. Way better than I ever imagined. This method actually works surprisingly well. It cools more consistently, doesn't require constant refilling like the ice method, and doesn't need any special materials. But the downside is huge. Once you cut into the CPU's surface, you've pretty much ruined its ability to work with a traditional cooler ever again. So yes, it's effective, but I strongly recommend never doing this. It's a one-way ticket, and once you go down that path, there's no going back. After all these experiments, one thing is clear. Yes, you can cool a CPU with all kinds of crazy methods. Ice cups, dust blowers, even carving grooves into the heat spreader. And some of them actually work better than expected, but none of them are practical, safe, or long-term solutions. A proper CPU cooler still wins every single time. These tests were fun, chaotic, and definitely educational, but please don't try this at home. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. See you in the next one.